Ladies and gentlemen, Archivist here. While the financial world was transfixed by President Trump, by his Greenland ultimatum and the resulting surge in silver prices, a geopolitical earthquake quietly unfolded along America's northern border. It was subtle, deliberate, and devastating. A move so abrupt and so strategically consequential that historians may one day mark it as the moment the USMCA effectively ended as we know it. On January 16, 2026, the Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, announced a stunning unilateral reversal of its trade policy toward the People's Republic of China, without consulting Washington, without warning Detroit, and in direct violation of the unified G7 strategy established in 2024. Ottawa slashed its punitive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The tariff rate collapsed from an impenetrable 100% wall to a near open door 6.1%. Let that number sink in. 6.1%. This was not a minor adjustment, not a regulatory tweak. It was the complete dismantling of the North American protective barrier. For the past 2 years, the United States and Canada had moved in lockstep. The rationale was clear. Chinese EVs, heavily subsidized by the CCP, posed an existential threat to the North American auto industry. To protect jobs in Michigan and Ontario, both nations erected a 100% tariff wall. It was economic siege warfare, but on Tuesday, Canada opened the gates. Under the new agreement, up to 49,000 Chinese EVs will be allowed into Canada each year at the low most favored nation rate, with the cap automatically rising to 70,000 within 5 years. To a casual observer, 49,000 vehicles may sound insignificant, roughly 3% of Canada's total auto market. But in an industry built on razor-thin margins, a 3% flood of ultra-cheap inventory is enough to collapse pricing power across the entire market. Canada has effectively signaled that it is no longer willing to absorb the economic cost of America's trade war with Beijing. It has chosen cheaper consumer goods over alliance solidarity. Why now? Why take this risk? The official narrative from Ottawa centers on affordability and climate urgency. Prime Minister Carney, facing a restless electorate in a stagnant economy, argued that Canadians cannot be denied access to affordable green technology over geopolitical squabbles. With the average North American EV priced near 55,000 Canadian dollars, the transition was slipping out of reach for the average family. Chinese EVs, specifically the BYD Seagull and the Geely Panda, sell globally for under 15,000 US dollars. Even after shipping, they can arrive in Toronto for roughly 25,000 Canadian dollars. By dropping the tariff, Carney is effectively offering a $30,000 discount to Canadian car buyers. It is populism wrapped in environmentalism. We must meet our 2030 emissions targets, the environment minister declared, and we cannot do that without Chinese capacity. But strip away the rhetoric, and the real motive is far more basic: economic survival. Canada has been buckling under U.S. protectionism. The American economy is turning inward. Trump-era America First policies have hammered Canadian steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber with relentless tariffs. The USMCA is up for review in July 2026, and Washington has made it clear it intends to tighten the screws, not loosen them. Ottawa felt abandoned. Being America's junior partner meant absorbing the pain without sharing in the gains. At the same time, Beijing was applying pressure of its own. In retaliation for Canada's 2024 tariffs, China devastated Canadian agriculture, slapping a 100% tariff on canola and effectively freezing pea and pork exports. A multi-billion-dollar lifeline to Western Canada vanished overnight. Caught between a hostile Washington and a coercive Beijing, Ottawa made its choice. They blinked. By slashing the EV tariff to just 6%, Canada didn't merely adjust a policy, it cut a separate deal. Ottawa secured a de facto peace agreement with Beijing. In exchange for opening its auto market, China agreed to reduce its punitive tariffs on Canadian canola seed to 15% by March 1, 2026. This is a textbook resources for technology swap. Canada gets to export crops, low-margin, low-value commodities. China gets to export advanced manufacturing, high-margin, high-value goods. It represents a quiet reversion to a colonial-style economic model. Canada ships raw resources out and imports finished products back in. But the biggest loser in this deal is not Canada. It is the United States auto industry. Canada has just created a massive backdoor into the North American market. While Washington maintains a 100% tariff wall to protect Detroit from Chinese competition, Ottawa has lowered the drawbridge. The result is a powerful arbitrage opportunity that threatens to fracture the integrated North American auto supply chain, a system that has existed largely intact since the Auto Pact of 1965. The 6% betrayal is the first major crack in the Western alliance against China's industrial overcapacity. It exposes the uncomfortable truth. The so-called United Front is a myth. When economic pain becomes severe enough, alliances fracture. Now Detroit is staring at a nightmare scenario, a porous northern border where the world's cheapest and most advanced EVs are stacking up, waiting for a pathway south. The immediate panic-stricken question echoing through the boardrooms of GM, Ford, and Stellantis is simple. Can these Chinese cars leak into the United States? If a BYD Seagull enters Canada paying only a 6% tariff, can it then be driven or shipped into Michigan duty-free? On paper, the answer is no. The USMCA's rules of origin are strict by design. To cross the US-Canada border tariff-free, a passenger vehicle must contain at least 75% North American content. That means 75% of the vehicle's value, steel, batteries, labor, glass, must originate in the United States, Canada, or Mexico. A BYD imported fully assembled from Shenzhen to Toronto clearly fails that test. It contains virtually zero North American content. If that car attempted to enter the US for resale, it would still face America's punitive tariff. But the real threat is far more insidious than direct transshipment. The danger lies in component laundering and manufacturing creep. The agreement Canada signed is not limited to importing finished vehicles. It explicitly anticipates significant Chinese joint venture investment in Canada within 3 years. BYD, Geely, and SAIC are not just shipping cars north. They are preparing to build them there. Factories, assembly plants, Ontario. Once manufacturing occurs on Canadian soil, the entire equation changes. A Chinese automaker can use Canadian steel, cheap and plentiful, Canadian aluminum, battery minerals sourced from Canadian mines, many of which Chinese firms are aggressively buying into. From there, the numbers start to move. Through accounting alchemy, companies can blend high-cost North American labor and materials with low-cost Chinese intellectual property, battery cells, and software. Push the regional value content to 75%, and suddenly that vehicle is legally a North American car, eligible for duty-free entry into the United States. This is the Trojan Horse strategy. Canada becomes the assembly hub through which Chinese technology penetrates the US market, bypassing tariffs entirely. The car arrives Chinese, gets washed clean in Canada, and crosses the border reborn. And that's before addressing the most dangerous issue of all, software provenance and data security. Modern EVs are not just cars, they are rolling supercomputers. They carry cameras, LiDAR, microphones, GPS systems. They map streets, monitor driver behavior, sync with personal devices, and transmit data continuously. The U.S. Commerce Department has already proposed banning Chinese connected vehicles and software on national security grounds. Washington does not want Chinese servers harvesting data from American roads. But if Canada allows these vehicles to operate freely on its highways, and those vehicles later cross the border, America's digital firewall collapses just as surely as its tariff wall. And that is the true cost of the 6% decision. Tourism or trade, it doesn't matter. Once the data fence is breached, it's breached. You cannot stop a Canadian tourist driving a BYD from crossing into Buffalo or Detroit. The moment that vehicle enters the US network, it begins collecting data. And because the North American auto sector is deeply integrated, where components cross the border up to 7 times during production, it is nearly impossible to fully isolate the Canadian market from the American one. If Canada adopts Chinese battery standards, such as the LFP chemistry that dominates China, and builds its charging infrastructure around them, the problem deepens. What emerges is technical divergence. North America splits into two technological spheres. On one side, the U.S. sphere, dominated by Tesla, GM, Ford, and American charging and safety standards. On the other, a Canadian sphere increasingly shaped by cheaper, more advanced Chinese technology. That split destroys the economies of scale the U.S. auto industry depends on. Detroit cannot compete with $15,000 EVs in Canada. They will lose market share in what has traditionally been their own backyard. Canada is the single largest export market for U.S. automakers. If that market is captured by BYD and its peers, Detroit's profitability collapses. Ford and GM rely on high-margin North American sales to subsidize losses elsewhere. If the Canadian profit pool dries up, their financial model breaks. This isn't unprecedented. In the 1980s, Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda built factories in the U.S. and Canada to bypass voluntary export restraints. But this time, the competitor is not an ally. It is a strategic rival. And the technology transfer isn't mechanical, it's digital and electrochemical. By inviting Chinese factories into Ontario, Canada isn't just importing cars, it's importing China's industrial ecosystem. Suppliers follow, battery plants follow, software stacks follow. Before long, the entire Ontario auto cluster becomes dependent on Chinese intellectual property. And once that dependency takes root, it is nearly impossible to unwind. From Washington's perspective, the United States now faces a hostile industrial base on its northern border, one actively collaborating with America's primary geopolitical rival. That is why the White House views the 6% deal not as trade policy, but as a breach of the continental security architecture. To understand why Ottawa would risk detonating its relationship with Washington in order to sign a deal with Beijing, you have to understand the pain trade. You have to understand the ruthless efficiency of Chinese economic coercion. China has perfected the art of targeting the political pressure points of democracies. When Canada followed the U.S. and imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs in 2024, Beijing did not retaliate by taxing Canadian cars. That would have been pointless. Canada exports very few vehicles to China. Instead, Beijing went after the Canadian government's political base. Western Canada, the Prairies, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. China is the single largest buyer of Canadian canola, purchasing more than $4 billion annually for cooking oil and animal feed. In retaliation, Beijing slapped a 100% tariff on Canadian canola and launched aggressive anti-dumping investigations into Canadian peas, pork, and beef. The impact was immediate and devastating. Canola exports to China collapsed overnight. Prices across the prairies cratered. Farmers were left with silos full of seed they couldn't sell. The basis, the gap between futures and cash prices, blew out to historic levels, leaving producers paid pennies on the dollar. Bankruptcies surged, and the timing was no accident. Canada was entering a volatile political season. The Prime Minister's approval ratings were already weak. He could not afford an agrarian revolt in the West that would spill eastward and destabilize the country. China understood that. Beijing effectively took the Canadian agricultural sector hostage. They put a gun to the head of the farmer and delivered a message to Ottawa. Drop the EV tariffs, or the farms bleed. Ottawa did the math. On one side stood the United States, an economy slowing, a hostile administration threatening sweeping global tariffs of 10 to 20%, and on the other stood China, applying pressure where it hurt most, and Canada chose survival. Washington demanded more, concessions on dairy, on lumber, and offered nothing in return, no relief, only pressure. On the other side stood China. China offered a lifeline. Beijing said, "We will lift the canola ban. We will buy your peas. We will buy your pork. All you have to do is let our cars in." It was a transaction. By agreeing to the 6% deal, Canada saved its farmers. The agreement stipulates that China will reduce tariffs on Canadian canola seed to 15% by March 1st, 2026. Anti-dumping investigations into pork are terminated. Commodity flows resume, but the price was the manufacturing future of Ontario. This decision exposes a deep structural fault line inside the Canadian economy, the long simmering conflict between the resource economy and the industrial economy. Oil, gas, agriculture, and mining versus manufacturing, autos, and advanced technology. Historically, Ontario's auto sector dictated Canadian trade policy. In 2026, that hierarchy flipped. Ottawa chose the resource economy. They sacrificed the future of a domestic auto industry already struggling to transition to EVs, an industry propped up by subsidies, to preserve the immediate cash flow of Western farmers. They chose the short-term crop over the long-term industrial strategy. It was pragmatic, it was rational, and it carries catastrophic long-term geopolitical consequences. This decision sends a signal to the world. U.S. allies are vulnerable. The United Front has a price tag. If Washington cannot offer market access because of its own protectionism, allies will eventually turn to China to survive. China didn't just buy access to the Canadian auto market. They bought a wedge. They bought leverage, something to drive between Washington and Ottawa, and they demonstrated a repeatable strategy: fracture the Western alliance by exploiting each country's specific economic weak points. Canada is the first domino. Germany, dependent on Chinese auto sales, could be next. Brazil, dependent on soy exports, is already there. The canola hostage crisis is a masterclass in how China weaponizes its consumer market for geopolitical ends. Faced with a choice between economic ideology and economic survival, Canada chose survival. The 6% betrayal fundamentally redraws the investment map of North America. For 3 decades, investors treated the U.S. and Canada as a single economic fortress, North America, unified and indivisible. That assumption is now dead. We are a fractured continent. The United States retreats behind a tariff wall. Canada hedges its bets and pivots toward Asia. Mexico is caught in the crossfire. This creates volatility, but it also creates opportunity. So how do you position for a bifurcated North American market? How do you trade the betrayal? You follow the Archivist protocol. Protocol Rule 1, short the legacy automaker. The arrival of cheap Chinese EVs in Canada is a death blow to the pricing power of legacy manufacturers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, in that market. Canada is brutally price sensitive. Gas prices are inflated by carbon taxes. Consumers want EVs, but they cannot afford $60,000 vehicles like the Mustang Mach-E or the Chevrolet Blazer. Enter BYD. A BYD Dolphin at roughly 25,000 Canadian dollars changes everything. Legacy automakers simply cannot compete at that price point. Their cost structures are too high, and when consumers are offered a cheaper vehicle with better range, better software, and better technology, they will choose it. Canada becomes a killing field for U.S. auto margins. Watch Canadian market share data closely in Q1 and Q2 of 2026. If BYD and Geely capture even 5 to 10% of the market rapidly, Detroit's stock valuations will reprice lower. Their safest export market disappears. Action: underweight or short U.S. legacy automakers with heavy Canadian exposure. Protocol Rule 2, long Canadian agriculture. The removal of Chinese tariffs is an immediate, powerful, bullish signal for Canadian agricultural assets. The hostage crisis is over. The handcuffs are off. Companies tied to canola processing, grain handling, and agricultural exports stand to benefit first and fastest. And that is where the smart money will move next. Fertilizer production will rebound immediately. Volumes will recover almost overnight. Look at companies like Nutrien. Look at the major grain handlers. Look at the railways, CN Rail and CPKC, that move grain from the prairies to the port of Vancouver. The flow of grain westward to China is about to surge. This is a direct trade on the peace deal. The farmers have cash again. They will buy fertilizer. They will buy equipment. They will reinvest. The entire Western Canadian agricultural ecosystem lights up at once. This is a broad-based buy. Protocol Rule 3. Watch Canadian battery metals. This is the most strategic play of all. The trade agreement explicitly anticipates Chinese investment in Canadian manufacturing. China dominates battery refining and processing, but it lacks secure access to raw materials. Canada has what China needs: lithium, nickel, cobalt. Until now, Ottawa has used national security reviews to block Chinese firms from acquiring Canadian mining assets. This deal signals a thaw, a softening of that stance. If Chinese firms are allowed to build car factories in Canada, they will also be allowed, formally or informally, to lock down supply chains. Focus on Canadian junior miners with critical mineral assets in Quebec and Ontario, especially those that are shovel-ready or near production. These are prime takeover and joint venture targets. China brings the capital. China brings the refining technology. Canada brings the rock. The 6% deal is a green light for M&A across the Canadian mining sector. Protocol Rule 4. Monitor the U.S. response and currency risk. This is the wild card, the one variable that can blow up the entire trade. President Trump will not view this as a policy disagreement. He will view it as betrayal. The USMCA and his framework exists to exclude China, not to provide them an on-ramp. Expect retaliation. Washington could impose secondary tariffs on Canadian goods, arguing they are transshipped from China. Border inspections at the Detroit-Windsor crossing could tighten dramatically, slowing trade to a crawl. The border thickens. That brings extreme volatility to the Canadian dollar. Historically, the CAD traded primarily on oil. Now it will trade on trade war risk. If Washington threatens to tear up the USMCA over this deal, the Canadian dollar could fall sharply against the US dollar. Chinese investment flows might offset some of that pressure, but the risk is asymmetric, and it skews decisively to the downside. Action: hedge your CAD exposure. If you hold Canadian assets, make sure you are comfortable with currency risk in a scenario where Washington declares economic war on Ottawa. Canada has blinked. Caught between Chinese economic coercion and American indifference, Ottawa chose to cut a deal with Beijing. The North American wall against Chinese EVs has been breached. The 6% tariff is not a barrier. It is a welcome mat. The result is a two-speed auto market in North America, and a diplomatic rupture that will reshape the continent for a generation. The trade war is no longer external. It's domestic. The united front is dead. This is Archivist. The protocol is active.